On September 19th, 1777, the Battle of Freeman's Farm was fought in upstate New York. You might better know it as the First Battle of Saratoga. The Saratoga campaign was one of those turning points in history. It was the first time ever in history that a British army had been forced to surrender in the field. It was the first significant victory for the Continental Army in the American Revolution. In every battle there are many voices, but few louder than the artillery and the guns of the battles of Saratoga had something to say. In Frankfort, Kentucky, there is, in the collection of the office of the Adjutant General of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, a British-made 3-pounder cannon, a type of small cannon that's sometimes called a grasshopper. The cannon was captured by Colonel Richard M. Johnson's Regiment of Kentucky Mounted Rifles after the October 5, 1813 Battle of the Thames. It was an important battle, a battle in which famously the Shawnee chief and important British ally Tecumseh was killed, by some accounts by Colonel Johnson himself. The cannon was then refurbished with a new carriage in Pennsylvania and then presented to Kentucky Governor Isaac Shelby, who had been the state's first governor. That carriage was destroyed when the first state arsenal burned in 1836, and a new carriage was built. A true piece of history, but hang on. The piece had actually started the War of 1812 in American hands. In August of 1812, it was defending Detroit. Fort Detroit had fallen by siege, although more accurately by bluff and deception. The American commander, William Hull, was eventually accused of cowardice. The 3-pounder cannon was lost with the fort, captured by the British and taken into Canada. So the little cannon had already gone from defeat to victory by the time it was presented to Governor Shelby. But that's not the start of the story, because the cannon had actually been captured long before. When in 1777 British General John Burgoyne began his campaign to capture the strategically important Hudson River Valley, he brought along 130 artillery pieces. He brought with him a variety of artillery, the best available at the time. One such artillery piece was the 3-pounder cannon. Weighing over 200 pounds, the cannon fired an iron ball weighing about 3 pounds, thus the name 3-pounder cannon. The British Army designed this gun as a highly portable infantry support weapon. The name was likely derived from how quickly the gun could be moved, hopping around the battlefield like a grasshopper. A particularly small type of piece called a battalion gun, the grasshopper was minimally effective against fortifications, but its relative mobility was well suited to the frontier, could give firepower support to infantry. These cannon were cast in bronze in England, mostly in 1776. Bronze is less brittle than iron, so the guns could be made thinner and lighter, making them useful on the frontier. Burgoyne's campaign mostly took place in the wilderness. The example in Frankfort has long been known as the Burgoyne cannon because it was first captured by American forces at the Battle of Saratoga. The U.S. Army utilized it until the gun went back into British hands following the fall of Detroit in 1812, only to be captured again in 1813 and given to the governor of Kentucky. The 2 battles of Saratoga that led to Burgoyne's surrender on October 7, 1777, were a turning point in the War for Independence. Not only did the victory demonstrate that the Americans could win against a professional European army and give a boost to American morale, but it also convinced the French to formally join the fight, which then brought in the Spanish due to the secret Treaty of Aranjuez, as well as helping to convince the Dutch to join the war effort via financial aid and to convince other European powers to remain neutral. Without that support, the war might well have ended differently, with significant impacts on future events. So that little Burgoyne 3-pounder in Frankfort, Kentucky has a big story to tell. It was one of 47 cannons captured, with Burgoyne's surrender. Of course, the Burgoyne cannon isn't the only one of those left. According to Saratoga National Battlefield, 18 6-pounders were captured after the battle, and at least 3 of those are still known to exist today. 2 of those are in private collections. The park has a 12-pounder, which they say was used to great effect by the British forces at Saratoga. It is less sure how much artillery that Gates was able to bring with him to the battle, and quite a lot of artillery changed hands in the course of the campaign. But, for example, Bemis Heights, a length of the American defensive line called the L, was supported by 22 artillery pieces, so the Patriots certainly had some cannon. But it is interesting because this was a frontier campaign and not the one you would think would include a lot of artillery that would have been devilishly difficult to drag through trackless wilderness. And in some ways it didn't. Burgoyne only brought 10 pieces to the climactic battle of the campaign, and that partially explains why there are so few pieces around today. But that doesn't mean that artillery weren't important in the campaign, or that the artillery can't teach us something about what it was like to be a soldier in that campaign. In fact, there are some compelling
first-hand accounts.
For example, there's Burgoyne himself. On October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne wrote to Lord Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, explaining his surrender, or, "I was induced to open a treaty with Major General Gates." In it, he writes of the battle now called Freeman's Farm, or the First Battle of Saratoga, and he says, "The artillery in general was distinguished." That doesn't say much, but Samuel Woodruff was serving with a Connecticut company under Captain Asa Bray. He was a participant in the battle and saw the artillery that Burgoyne was talking about. Here, on a level piece of ground of considerable extent called Freeman's Farms, thinly covered with yellow pines, the Royal Army formed an extensive line with the principal part of their artillery in the front. It's difficult to say how effective the artillery was, as the Americans were in the woods, and the Saratoga battlefield page writes that most of the damage was done to the trees. But Woodruff did see a specific action. As the grenadiers were driven back, Woodruff writes, still they had kept up respectable fire, both of artillery and musketry. A company of grenadiers reformed. Here they halted, formed, and made a stand, apparently determined to retrieve what they had lost by the repulse at the redoubts in the commencement of the action. There placed in their center and each flank a strong battery of brass field pieces. The carnage became frightful. Their gallant major received a musket ball through both legs, which placed him hors de combat. Retreat immediately ensued, leaving their dead and some of their wounded with 2 brass field pieces on the ground. Clearly, even a few artillery pieces can be very deadly, and it was also deadly for the crews. An estimated 75% of the artillery crews at Freeman's Farm became casualties. It isn't clear, as the British eventually kept the field, whether the 2 brass pieces that Woodruff mentions were captured or if the Burgoyne gun was among them. The rest of Woodruff's narrative deals with helping the wounded and burying the dead, and makes no further mention of the guns that had helped to inflict those casualties. But we do know that cannon often changed hands. David Holbrook served in a Rhode Island militia company and wrote an account of the Battle of Bennington, which occurred on August 16th.
Interestingly, that part of the battle was fought in the New Hampshire Grants area, which was the subject of a land dispute that had given rise to the independent Vermont Republic. Wikipedia describes the battle as being a joint American/Vermont victory. We might not have always agreed amongst ourselves, but we both hated the British.
An outnumbered British foraging force was defeated in the battle. Holbrook describes a harrowing bayonet charge that is fascinating reading, but in the midst of the charge he notes, as we came upon the enemy's lines, their field pieces being charged, a Sergeant Luddington knocked down the man with the port fore and caught hold of the limber and whirled about the piece and fired it at the enemy, and the blaze overtook them before they got 10 rods and mowed down a large number of them. The scene of an army's own artillery being turned against them would have been recognized in the Napoleonic Wars and the U.S. Civil War, and it's certainly evidence that even the relatively limited amount of artillery used in the Saratoga campaign could be devastating. And the changing hands didn't always work out so well. Fort Ticonderoga had started the war in British hands, then been captured famously by Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys in May of 1775. The fort had in turn fallen again to an overwhelming British force in June of 1777. In September, a force under General Benjamin Lincoln was in the area and made some attacks on the defenses. Thomas Wood was serving with a Massachusetts militia unit under a Colonel Herrick in an attack on Fort Ticonderoga that occurred at roughly the same time that Gates was meeting Burgoyne at the First Battle of Saratoga. The action was most important in that it freed a number of American prisoners, but Wood noted an interesting exchange of artillery. He mentions that Captain Allen, not related to Ethan Allen, was ordered by Colonel Herrick to attack a captain's guard stationed on Mount Defiance, who had charge of a brass 18-pounder, a part of whom he captured and a part of whom escaped to Fort Ticonderoga. While the fort wasn't taken, some outer breastworks were, and there Wood noted this occurrence. They then marched directly into the breastwork of Fort Ticonderoga, and here they found our cannon, which had been left by our troops when they retreated, which they found spiked. Our commanding officer ordered these cannons put in order, and with the aforementioned 18-pounders were turned upon the enemy within the said fort. These cannons were likely brought originally in the French and Indian War. The fort had been taken by the British, and of course at the time the Americans, in 1759 by bombardment, and therefore the artillery used, and what might have been captured from the French, were left to defend the fort because it was too expensive to haul them back out. They had been captured with the fort by Allen in 1775. Many of those had been removed by Colonel Henry Knox and had greatly aided the fledgling Patriot artillery, but some had been left behind. 18-pounders were naval guns. They weighed over 4,000 pounds, and they were not easy to move. These pieces had already changed hands 3 times. The Americans had captured them from the British, who recaptured them from the Americans, who took them again from the British. They were then mounted on a colonial sloop and used to attack a British position on Diamond Island on Lake George. Wood said this engagement was with cannon and a very severe engagement. Attacking fortifications defended by cannons, even using cannons, was not an easy task. The sloop was badly damaged and had to be burned, and the cannon presumably lost. Ticonderoga held, but was abandoned after Burgoyne's surrender, which came after the Battle of Bemis Heights, also called the Second Battle of Saratoga. Burgoyne described the artillery deployed. A detachment of 1,500 regular troops with two 12-pounders, two howitzers, and six 6-pounders were ordered to move and was commanded by myself. As the British lines collapsed, he wrote, orders were given to Major General Phillips and Riedesel to cover the retreat, with such troops as were most ready for the purpose, return for the defense of them. The troops retreated hard, pressed, but in good order. They were obliged to leave 6 pieces of cannon. All the horses had been killed, and most of the artillerymen, who had behaved as usual with the utmost bravery under the command of Major Williams, being either killed or wounded. Again, as deadly as artillery were, it was almost as deadly to be a member of their crews, who would have been specifically targeted and whose pieces would have been difficult to move in a heated battle. Henry Jolly was a private in Morgan's regiment and witnessed the battle. He recalled, General Arnold moved on with his brave Yankees and attacked the British grenadiers and drove them from their cannon. But Benedict Arnold in this engagement was also severely wounded by a musket ball and removed from the battle. Another dramatic description of the impact of artillery in the campaign came from the wife of Major General Friedrich Adolf Riedesel of Brunswick, who commanded all of the German and American Indian troops of Burgoyne's army. The letters of the Baroness von Riedesel are one of the best references that we have of the campaign from the British side, although she didn't report so much directly on the battles themselves, but from behind the lines is one of only a few wives of officers to remain with the army. In one letter, she writes about being in a farmhouse cellar that was serving as a field hospital, and this extraordinary moment. 11 cannonballs passed through the house and made a tremendous noise. A poor soldier who was about to have a leg amputated lost the other one by one of these balls. All his comrades ran away at that moment, and when they returned, they found him in one corner of the room, in the agonies of death.
Being bombarded had to be terrible, and death was random.
Shortly after, the husband of one of the other wives was struck. The Baroness writes, his wife was soon called out and found that the lieutenant was yet alive, though one of his arms had been shot off near the shoulder by a cannonball. We heard his groans and lamentations during the whole night, which were dreadfully re-echoed through the vaulted cellars. And in the morning, he expired.
Now, descriptions of battles and tactics and generals, that might be interesting, but that letter describing the agonizing suffering of a young officer as witnessed by his wife perhaps best encapsulates what it was like on an 18th century battlefield.
The Baroness also notes another interesting incident regarding the remains of Brigadier General Simon Fraser, shot by one of Daniel Morgan's rifle corps during the battle. The mortally wounded officer was placed in the Baroness's care. He died that evening. We were informed that General Burgoyne intended to comply with General Fraser's last request and have him buried at 6 o'clock in the place which he had designated. This occasioned a useless delay and contributed to our military misfortunes. At 6 o'clock, the corpse was removed, and we saw all of the generals with their retinues on the hill, assisting at the funeral ceremony. The English chaplain, Mr. Burundel, officiated. Cannonballs flew around and above the assembled mourners. General Gates protested afterwards that had he known what was going on, he would have stopped the fire immediately. Many cannonballs flew close by, but my whole attention was engaged by the funeral scene.
Again, this very personal description relates the terror of bombardment and how it was seen by the commanders.
Burgoyne was pushed back at Bemis Heights, or Second Saratoga. Burgoyne was low on supplies, his army dwindling. He had no hope then of reinforcement, and the American forces were growing in strength daily. He was in a difficult position when he called a council of war of his senior officers on October 13th. In terms of the campaign and artillery, perhaps the most interesting anecdote came from a private named Simeon Alexander, who was in a Massachusetts militia regiment under a Captain Merriman the day of Burgoyne's council. We were soon after marched down the river to a place opposite to where Burgoyne's lay, and while there a circumstance occurred which I shall relate. There was a small red house at the other side of the river, situated on a small hill near a little river called Schuyler's River. This house was just out of musket shot from our position, and an officer one day observed, "Who knows but Burgoyne is in that house?" "We'll try it and see," said another. So they rough a gun to bear in the house and fired. And we heard the cannonball strike the house, and immediately a number of men, who we thought were officers, ran out of it. During the following night there was a cessation of arms agreed upon, and the next day some of the British soldiers came over to our camp. And one of them told me that Burgoyne and his officers were holding a council of war in that house at that time, and the ball passed through it.
Did this cannonball seal the surrender? Well, Burgoyne never mentioned it.
Some of these accounts were contemporary, but some, as with Alexander's story, came after 1832, when Congress offered a pension to veterans of the war, but required proof of service beyond a reasonable doubt. These narratives were collected as a result of that bill, and so were written around 55 years after the events. It's a great record of the time, and the original applications are in the Library of Congress, but they may have been a bit embellished.
The stories of the Guns of Saratoga, so much as we know them, give a glimpse into a pivotal campaign in history and what it must have been like to be a soldier in that campaign. History told through the artifacts that remain. But there's one more good story. There was a cannon that was captured at Saratoga, a 6-pounder that came to be known as the Surrender Cannon. Remained in the service of the U.S. Army through the Revolution, probably through the War of 1812, maybe beyond, it's not really clear, but at some point it wound up in the possession of the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, where it was put on display at Brooklyn's Prospect Park around the turn of the century. In 1932, it was loaned to the town of Saratoga, New York, to be part of a display there, but apparently the display never came together, and it wound up sitting in the garage of the local historian until he passed away in 1961. And then it just disappeared. It was apparently illegally sold into the private market, although it's not clear by whom. Went through several hands and eventually was made as a donation to the Tuscaloosa, Alabama Museum of Art. In 2009, a privately owned 6-pounder was on display at Saratoga as a loan, and a visitor looked at it and said, "I've seen one just like that in Alabama." And that struck a memory with one of the park rangers about this legend of the lost cannon. An investigation ensued, and it turned out that it was, in fact, the missing cannon. And because it had been captured from the British, the Army still considered it their property and reclaimed it. The museum cooperated. In 2023, the Army donated it into the permanent collection of Saratoga National Battlefield. One more cannon that was lost and recaptured. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.